His heart was a fortress built of cotton and cruelty, until a quiet presence breached its walls. But before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The dust coated everything in a fine, relentless film. It settled on the wide veranda, on the polished mahogany that somehow still held the scent of lemon oil beneath the grit, on the drooping leaves of the magnolias, and most heavily, on the fields stretching out under a sky that was often too bright, too indifferent. Elias Thorne surveyed his domain from the upper gallery, a man carved from the same harsh landscape, etched with lines of authority and something colder, less yielding. They called him the Cotton Baron, a title he wore like a crown of thorns, each spike a testament to the ruthless ambition that had built this empire, this sprawling testament to his will. He was a figure of imposing silence and sudden, sharp commands, his presence casting a shadow that seemed to drain the warmth from the already stifling air. His employees, from the overseers barking orders in the fields to the house staff who moved like ghosts through the cool, cavernous rooms, navigated his moods with the wary skill of sailors charting treacherous waters. There was no softness in Elias Thorne, no gentle word, no casual glance that didn't hold the weight of assessment or dismissal. His eyes, the color of storm-laden skies, missed nothing, yet seemed to see only what he deemed necessary for the efficient, profitable operation of his world. He had built this life on cotton, on leverage, on the unspoken understanding that power belonged to those who took it, and held it without apology. His life was a study in control, a meticulously ordered universe where sentiment was a weakness, an inefficiency to be purged. He had purged it long ago, or so he believed. He stood there, a sentinel against the encroaching world, the sun beating down on his shoulders, feeling nothing but the familiar, calcifying weight of his own making. The plantation sprawled beneath him, a kingdom built on forced labor and the relentless cycle of the seasons, a cycle he sought to control, to bend to his will just as he bent everything and everyone else. The air hummed with the drone of cicadas and the distant rhythmic chants from the fields, sounds that were the heartbeat of his power, a constant low thrumming beneath the surface of his consciousness. He liked the quiet of the house, the stillness broken only by the necessary movements of those who served him. Noise was disorder, and disorder was anathema to Elias Thorne. He valued silence, the kind that allowed him to hear the calculations running in his mind, the strategies forming and reforming, the ceaseless accounting of gains and losses, not just of money, but of control, of influence, of the careful, deliberate construction of his own unassailable position. He was a man who had learned early that vulnerability was a luxury he could not afford, and he had priced it out of his existence with brutal efficiency. This plantation, these fields, this house, they were not just property. They were layers of armor, thick and unyielding, protecting a core that he rarely, if ever, examined. He moved through his days with the precision of a well-oiled machine, every interaction transactional, every relationship defined by its utility. He had no friends, only associates, no confidants, only employees bound by fear or necessity. His family, what was left of it, was a distant echo, a faded photograph on a mantelpiece, a source of old wounds he kept carefully closed. This was the life he had chosen, the life he had built, stone by heavy stone, bale by heavy bale. It was a life devoid of warmth, perhaps, but secure, predictable, entirely his own. The heat pressed in, a physical manifestation of the tension that perpetually clung to the air around him. He took a deep, slow breath, the scent of cotton blossom and rich earth filling his lungs, a scent that was both the source of his wealth and a constant reminder of the harsh realities that underpinned it. This was his empire, and he ruled it with an iron fist, unchallenged, unyielding, utterly alone in the fortress of his own making. He turned from the railing, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the polished wood, a sound that announced his presence, a sound that instilled a quiet, immediate readiness in anyone within earshot. His day had begun, a repetition of the days before, each one a carefully orchestrated performance of power and control. Ada moved through the halls like a whisper, her presence barely disturbing the still air. She was one of many in the sprawling household, a figure in the periphery, tasked with the endless cycle of cleaning, dusting, arranging, and rearranging. Her uniform was simple, practical, designed for invisibility, and for a long time, that was precisely what she was, invisible. To Elias Thorne, she was simply part of the machinery, another cog in the complex operation of running a grand house. He saw her, perhaps, but he did not see her. She was the hand that refilled his inkwell, the shadow that straightened a rug he had scuffed, the quiet presence that laid out his evening clothes. She had learned the art of observation from the margins, seeing the intricate dance of power and submission that played out daily within these walls. She saw the fear in the eyes of the other staff, the deference shown by the overseers, the strained politeness of the infrequent visitors. And she saw Elias Thorne, not just the cotton baron, but the man who inhabited that formidable shell. She saw the way his jaw tightened when he was displeased, the rare flicker of something unreadable in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, the way he preferred his coffee black and scalding hot, a physical mirroring of his own nature. She learned his routines, his habits, the subtle tells that indicated his mood. It was a matter of survival, a way to anticipate the currents of his temper and avoid the inevitable clashes. She had her own reasons for being here, buried deep beneath the quiet surface she presented to the world. Reasons that were as complex and layered as the history of this place itself. She carried her own burdens, her own silent griefs, her own quiet determination. Her eyes, a soft, steady hazel, held a depth that belied her youth and her unassuming demeanor. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her hands capable, her steps light. She noticed the details others missed, the dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight, the particular scent of the magnolias after a rain, the way the light changed on the fields at different times of the day. These small observations were her anchor, her connection to a world beyond the confines of her duties, a world that existed inside her own mind, a place of refuge. She had arrived at the plantation several years ago, under circumstances she rarely spoke of, blending into the background like a chameleon. She learned the intricate hierarchy of the household staff, navigating the subtle rivalries and alliances with quiet diplomacy. She kept to herself, fostering an aura of polite reserve that kept others at a distance, protecting her own privacy. Her work was her focus, her quiet diligence her armor. She polished the same furniture he would scuff, straightened the same papers he would disarray, moving through the grand rooms like a spirit, leaving no trace of her presence save for the renewed gleam on a surface, the precise arrangement of a book. She saw the constant, relentless pressure under which Elias Thorne lived, a pressure he seemed to generate himself. She saw the isolation he had built around himself, a wall as imposing as any brick structure. She didn't pity him. Pity was another inefficient sentiment, but she observed him, and in that observation, a quiet understanding began to form, an understanding that was detached at first, like studying a specimen under a microscope, but which gradually began to take on a different shape, a different weight. She was a quiet observer in a loud, demanding world, a world dominated by the formidable figure of the cotton baron. He first noticed her, or rather registered her as more than just another uniform, on a day like any other, hot and thick with the promise of a storm that never seemed to break. He was in his study, poring over ledgers, the figures blurring in his tired eyes. A cup of coffee, long since gone cold, sat beside him. He reached for it automatically, his mind still wrestling with production yields and market prices. A quiet sound, barely a rustle, and the cold cup was replaced by a warm one, the rich aroma of fresh coffee steaming into the air. He paused, his hand hovering. He hadn't summoned anyone. He looked up, expecting to see the usual figure, the older woman who typically saw to his needs. Instead, he saw Ada. She stood perfectly still, her eyes downcast, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. There was no obsequiousness in her posture, none of the nervous energy he usually detected in the staff when they were in his presence. Just a quiet competence, a simple act performed without fanfare. I saw your cup was cold, sir," she murmured, her voice soft, almost swallowed by the silence of the room. It wasn't an apology, not an excuse, just a plain statement of fact. He stared at her for a moment longer than was necessary. He noted the clean line of her jaw, the dark richness of her hair pulled back neatly from her face, the way her uniform was immaculately clean despite the dust. He saw, for the first time, the quiet strength in her stillness. It was unsettling. He was used to fear, to quick movements and averted gazes. Her quiet competence was a challenge, albeit an unintentional one. "Very well," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He picked up the warm cup, the heat a sudden unexpected comfort in his hands. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned to leave, melting back into the quiet efficiency of the house. He watched her go, a strange feeling coiling in his gut. It wasn't annoyance or anger. It was something else. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps? Or maybe just the irritation of having his predictable routine disrupted by a small, unexpected act of quiet initiative. He returned to his ledgers, but the figures seemed less sharp, less demanding. The warmth of the coffee lingered in his hands, a tangible reminder of the brief, silent encounter. He dismissed it as a triviality, a minor disruption in the grand order of his day. But later, he found himself recalling the moment, the simple act, the quiet presence. He began to notice her more after that, not actively seeking her out, but simply seeing her when she was there. He saw her moving through the halls, tending to her duties with that same quiet efficiency. He saw her in the periphery of his vision, a constant, unobtrusive presence. He noticed that she never seemed to hurry, yet her tasks were always completed, and completed well. There was a grace in her movements, a quiet dignity that set her apart, subtly, from the others. He started leaving his cold coffee cup out, a silent, unspoken test. And each time it would be replaced by a warm one, without a word, without a request. It became a small, private ritual, a subtle acknowledgement between them that bypassed the usual dynamics of command and obedience. It was a tiny crack in the armor he wore, a hairline fracture in the carefully constructed edifice of his control, and it was initiated by a quiet maid, armed with nothing more than a warm cup of coffee and a steady, unassuming presence. The tension wasn't overt, but it was there, a low hum beneath the surface of their interactions. It was the tension of two vastly different worlds colliding, of an unexpected connection forming in a place where connections were either transactional or forbidden. The plantation held its secrets close, buried beneath the soil like forgotten roots. Elias Thorne had his own secrets, layers of history that had shaped the man he was. One of these was the library, a room he rarely allowed anyone else to enter. It was filled with books, leather-bound volumes that smelled of aged paper and dust, relics of a different time, a different man. His father. His father had been different. Not soft, but perhaps less brittle, less consumed by the need for absolute control. He had loved books, had seen something in them that Elias had never understood, or perhaps had deliberately chosen not to understand. The library was a reminder of a path not taken, a life lived differently. It was also where the heat seemed to gather, stagnant and oppressive, the air thick with unspoken history. One afternoon, driven by some restless impulse, he found himself there. The room was in disarray, books out of place, a thick layer of dust coating every surface. It had been neglected for years. He felt a familiar wave of irritation, directed not just at the state of the room, but at the memories it evoked. He needed it cleaned. He needed it ordered, purged of its dust and its ghosts. He rang the bell for the house staff, his finger pressing down with unnecessary force. When the door opened, it was Ada. He hesitated for a moment, the usual sharp command catching in his throat. There was something about her quiet presence that always threw him off balance, if only slightly. "The library," he said, his voice gruff. "It needs to be cleaned. Thoroughly." He expected her to nod and leave, perhaps sending in a team. Instead, she simply said, "Yes, sir," her gaze steady for a brief moment before she lowered it. She didn't ask for help, didn't question the task. She simply accepted it. The next day, and for several days after, he heard the faint sounds of movement from the library. He didn't go in. He didn't supervise. Part of him expected her to fail, to be overwhelmed by the task, to leave it half-finished. But he also found himself curious. What would she make of that room, that repository of his father's quiet rebellion against the harshness of their world? When she finally informed him she was finished, he went in. The change was remarkable. The dust was gone, replaced by a faint scent of beeswax and old paper. The books were neatly arranged on the shelves, not just stacked, but ordered with a quiet logic he hadn't anticipated. It was as if she had understood the room, not just cleaned it. She stood by the doorway, her hands clasped, her expression unreadable. He walked deeper into the room, running a finger along the spine of a book, then across the surface of a polished table. Everything gleamed softly in the filtered light. He turned to her. "You did well," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. Praise was not a currency he dealt in freely. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice quiet. He looked around the room again, a sense of unexpected peace settling over him. It was still his father's library, but it felt less burdened now, less like a tomb of forgotten dreams, and more like a room that could breathe again. He noticed a small vase of freshly cut magnolias on the side table, their creamy petals a stark contrast to the dark wood and leather. He hadn't asked for them. It was another small, unsolicited act, a quiet offering. "The flowers?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. They brightened the room, sir," she said, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. He said nothing more, just stood there, the weight of his usual demeanor pressing down on him. But something had shifted. The library, once a room of ghosts and burdens, now held a different kind of presence, a quiet warmth that had been brought into it by the hands of a silent maid. He didn't understand it, but he felt it, a subtle change in the atmosphere of his carefully controlled world. This quiet infiltration of his space, his history, was unnerving, yet not entirely unwelcome. The plantation was a microcosm of the world outside its gates, governed by unspoken rules and stark inequalities. The secondary characters, the overseers, the other house staff, the occasional visiting neighbors were all players in this rigid social drama. They represented the expectations, the biases, the cruelties of the time. Elias Thorne navigated this world with practiced ease, his power shielding him from many of its sharper edges, but also trapping him within its confines. He was the apex, the one whose approval mattered, whose displeasure was feared. The other staff members viewed Ada with a mixture of suspicion and quiet respect. She didn't gossip, didn't complain, didn't jockey for position. She simply did her work, her quiet competence a silent rebuke to their squabbling and anxieties. Some saw her reserve as arrogance, others as a clever strategy. The overseers, rough men hardened by the sun and the demands of the fields, treated the house staff with a casual contempt, seeing them as soft compared to the real work done outside. They sometimes made coarse jokes or threw challenging glances, particularly towards the younger women. Ada met their presence with polite, unyielding professionalism, her gaze calm and steady when circumstances demanded she look them in the eye. This quiet defiance, this refusal to be intimidated or flustered, seemed to annoy them, and sometimes Elias Thorne noticed it. He saw the way one of the overseers, a burly man named Jed, lingered a moment too long in the hallway when Ada was cleaning, his eyes lingering on her with an unwelcome possessiveness. He saw the way Ada simply continued her task, her back straight, her movements unbroken, as if Jed were merely a piece of furniture to be ignored. A familiar, unpleasant clenching sensation tightened in Elias's chest. It was not concern, he told himself. It was simply an annoyance, a disruption to the smooth functioning of his household. Jed's behavior was unprofessional, inefficient. He spoke to Jed later that day, his voice low and Calnal sharp. "Keep your eyes on the fields, Jed," he said, his gaze fixed and unwavering. "And keep your thoughts to yourself when you are inside this house. My house staff are here to work, not to be distracted." Jed's face paled slightly, a flicker of fear in his eyes. "Yes, sir." "Understood, sir." He dipped his head quickly and retreated. Elias watched him go, the unpleasant sensation in his chest easing, but not entirely disappearing. He told himself he was simply asserting his authority, maintaining order. But he knew, in a place he rarely acknowledged, that it was more than that. He had seen the quiet dignity in Ada's resistance, the subtle strength she possessed in the face of unwelcome attention, and for some reason, that strength resonated with him, a strange, unexpected echo in the hollow chambers of his own hardened heart. The stereotypical figures around them served as a constant backdrop, highlighting the restrictive nature of their world. They were the gossips, the sycophants, the bullies, the enforcers of societal norms and prejudices. Their presence underscored the quiet danger of any deviation from the expected roles, any hint of a connection that crossed the rigid lines of class and position. Ada's quiet competence and Elias's unexpected protection of her, however subtle, were small acts of subversion within this tightly controlled environment, tiny cracks appearing in the monolithic structure of the plantation's social order, observed by unseen eyes, whispered about in hushed tones. Flashbacks began to intrude on Elias's consciousness, brief, unwelcome glimpses into the past that had forged his present. They were not summoned deliberately, but surfaced like debris from a sunken ship, carried by the tides of his increasingly unsettled mind. He would be standing on the veranda, watching the setting sun paint the sky in hues of fire and shadow, and a memory would surface, the scent of his mother's perfume, a scent he hadn't thought of in decades, tied to a moment of unexpected fleeting tenderness. Or he would be in his study, the quiet broken only by the scratch of his pen, and he would hear his father's voice, not the commanding tone he used in public, but a softer, more contemplative sound, perhaps reading from one of the books in the now-cleaned library. These memories were unsettling because they contradicted the narrative he had built of his past, a narrative of hardship, of necessary ruthlessness, of a world that demanded a hard shell. They hinted at a different possibility, a different way of being that he had long since buried. He saw Ada in the garden one morning, kneeling by a patch of wildflowers that had sprung up stubbornly near the stables. She wasn't tending them. They were not part of the manicured grounds. She was simply looking at them, her face lifted to the sun, a soft, almost serene expression on her face. It was a look he had never seen on anyone on this plantation, least of all the staff, whose faces were usually etched with weariness or guardedness. It was a look of simple, unadulterated peace. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow, a jarring contrast to the tension that was his constant companion. He stopped walking, hidden behind a trellis covered in jasmine, and watched her. He watched her for a long time, longer than he would admit to himself. He saw the way she gently touched the petals of a small purple flower, as if it were something precious. He saw the way her shoulders relaxed, the tension that usually held her erect, melting away in the presence of something wild and untamed. And in that moment another memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Himself as a boy, no older than 8 or 9, hiding in this very garden, clutching a bruised bird he had found fallen from its nest, his heart aching with a grief he didn't understand. His father had found him there, and for once had not scolded him for shirking his lessons, but had simply knelt beside him, placing a large, gentle hand on his shoulder. It was a moment of connection, a brief, fragile bridge built between them before the demands of their world reasserted themselves. The memory faded, leaving behind a residue of longing and a sharp, almost painful awareness of the distance he had traveled from that boy, that moment. He looked at Ada again, still kneeling amongst the wildflowers, a quiet island of peace in the turbulent sea of his life. He didn't understand her connection to such simple things, her ability to find beauty in the wild, untamed corners of the world. It was a mystery to him, this quiet joy she seemed to possess, this inner stillness. It was a stillness that seemed to challenge his own restless, driven nature. It was also a stillness that drew him in, a silent gravitational pull he couldn't explain or resist. The contrast between her world, represented by the wildflowers and the quiet contemplation, and his world, built on control and harvested wealth, was stark. Yet, in that moment observing her, the lines between their worlds seemed to blur, just for a heartbeat. The flashbacks were serving a purpose, cracking open the hardened shell, allowing faint glimmers of his past, his potential for something other than harshness, to surface. And Ada, in her quiet, unassuming way, was the catalyst, the mirror reflecting back a part of himself he had thought long dead. The tension between them was a palpable thing, a silent current running beneath the surface of their sparse interactions. It wasn't animosity, not entirely. It was more complex, woven from the threads of their vastly different positions. His power, her quiet resilience, the unspoken histories they both carried. Their dialogue remained minimal, limited to necessary exchanges about household matters, but the subtext thickened with each passing day. A shared glance that lasted a fraction of a second too long, a pause that held a world of unspoken meaning, a simple question about the day's tasks that felt loaded with something entirely different. He found himself seeking her out, not overtly, but through calculated coincidences. He would linger in the hallway she was cleaning, finding some minor instruction to give, just to have her near. He would arrive in his study just as she was finishing tidying, his presence filling the room, watching her put away the last item, the air thick with unspoken communication. She, for her part, never initiated these encounters, but she met them with that same quiet, unyielding presence. Her eyes, when they met his, were calm and steady, neither defiant nor submissive. This neutrality was maddeningly intriguing. He was used to eliciting strong reactions: fear, respect, resentment, flattery. Her quiet calm was a puzzle he couldn't solve. He would ask her a question about the house, about a particular task, and her answers were always direct, efficient, devoid of unnecessary words. Yet beneath the simple words, he sensed layers of observation, of understanding that went beyond the surface. It was as if she saw him, truly saw him, in a way no one else dared to. This seeing was uncomfortable, challenging. He was accustomed to being seen as the Baron, the figure of power. Being seen as simply Elias was a vulnerability he wasn't prepared for. One evening, during a particularly stifling heat wave, the air thick and heavy, he found her sitting alone on the back steps, long after her duties should have ended. She was looking up at the stars, her face silhouetted against the indigo sky. He approached her quietly, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. She didn't startle, sensing his presence before he reached her. "Why are you still here, Ada?" he asked, his voice softer than he usually allowed it to be. She turned her head slowly, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, finding his in the faint light. "The air is cooler out here, sir," she replied simply. Another simple statement of fact, yet it carried a weight, an invitation perhaps, to share the small respite from the oppressive heat, both inside and out. He hesitated for a moment, the urge to retreat back into the familiar, controlled environment of the house, warring with a strange pull towards the quiet figure on the steps. He chose the latter. He sat down on the step beside her, a small distance between them. The silence stretched, comfortable yet charged. It was the longest time they had ever spent in each other's company without the pretense of a task or instruction. He followed her gaze to the sky, the countless stars like scattered diamonds on black velvet. "My father used to know the names of the constellations," he said, the words surprising even himself. They were pulled from the depths of a memory he hadn't consciously accessed in years. Ada remained silent, simply listening. "He would point them out," Elias continued, a rare note of melancholy entering his voice. "Said they were stories written in the sky." He stopped, embarrassed by the unexpected confession. She finally spoke, her voice a low murmur. "They still are, sir. You just have to know how to read them." Her words were simple, yet profound. They acknowledged his memory, validated his father's quiet wisdom, and offered a bridge, a shared understanding of something beyond the mundane realities of their lives. In the sparse dialogue, the heavy subtext, the shared silence under the star-filled sky, the tentative threads of a connection were being woven, fragile yet strong enough to withstand the oppressive weight of their world. The plantation, the house, even the air itself seemed to watch them, sensing the subtle shift in the established order. The atmosphere grew more tense, not with overt conflict yet, but with a simmering undercurrent of anticipation, of unspoken awareness. The secondary characters, the embodiment of the societal biases, began to react, their discomfort manifesting in whispers, knowing glances, a heightened scrutiny of both Elias and Ada. Jed, the overseer, glared openly now when he saw Ada, his eyes filled with resentment and something akin to suspicion. Other staff members grew quiet when Ada entered a room, their chatter dying down, their eyes following her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They saw the Baron's changed demeanor, the subtle softening around the edges when he was near her, the way his gaze lingered on her for a moment too long. They saw the impossible beginning to take shape, a dangerous blurring of lines they had been taught must remain starkly separate. These reactions served as a constant, External pressure, a reminder of the formidable barriers between their worlds. Elias felt it too, the weight of expectation, the silent judgment of those who depended on him, who understood the rules of their society and expected him to uphold them. His own internal conflict intensified. The man who had built his life on control and detachment found himself increasingly drawn to a woman whose quiet presence chipped away at his carefully constructed defenses. He began to seek Ada out more deliberately now, the calculated coincidences becoming less subtle. He would find reasons for her to be in his study, asking her to organize papers, to fetch books, tasks he could easily have assigned to others or done himself. The dialogue remained sparse, functional on the surface, but the true conversation happened in the shared silence, in the subtle gestures, the meeting of their eyes. He learned small things about her. Her favorite color was blue, the color of the sky after a storm. She could play a simple, melancholic tune on a forgotten piano in the drawing room when she thought no one was listening. She loved the smell of rain on dry earth. These were not the things a cotton baron was supposed to know about his maid, let alone care about. Each small piece of knowledge was a breach in his fortress, a tiny crack allowing light to filter in. He found himself wanting to know more, wanting to understand the quiet strength she possessed, the source of the peace he had seen in the garden. The tension escalated as their connection deepened, a silent tug-of-war between the forces pulling them together and the powerful societal currents pushing them apart. Flashbacks grew more frequent, more vivid, showing him moments of vulnerability he had long suppressed. His mother's illness, his father's quiet despair after a failed crop, the loneliness of his own childhood in this vast, impersonal house. These memories resonated with the quiet vulnerability he sensed beneath Ada's calm exterior, creating a strange, unexpected empathy. He found himself wanting to protect her, a fiercely unfamiliar emotion. He saw the dangers she faced simply by being near him, by becoming the object of his unintended, unspoken attention. The stares from the overseers, the whispers from the staff, they were signals, warnings. The world was closing in, sensing the anomaly, the deviation from the norm. The slow burn was building, the tension coiling tighter with each shared moment, each unspoken understanding, each external reaction that highlighted the impossibility of their connection. The stage was being set for a confrontation, not necessarily explosive, but deeply emotional, a pivotal moment where the forces of their world and the quiet strength of their connection would inevitably collide. The climax arrived not with a bang, but with a suffocating silence, a moment where the air grew heavy with unspoken words and inevitable consequences. It was precipitated by a seemingly small event, amplified by the accumulated tension and the watchful eyes of the plantation. One afternoon, during a gathering of local landowners at the Thorn estate, men as hard and unyielding as Elias himself, embodiments of the rigid societal structure, Ada was serving refreshments. She moved among them with her usual quiet grace, a figure in the background. One of the men, a particularly unpleasant individual known for his cruelty, made a crude remark directed at her, veiled just enough to pass as a misplaced attempt at humor among his peers, but sharp and demeaning in its intent. The laughter that followed was harsh and dismissive. Elias, standing nearby, felt a jolt, sharp and immediate. It was not just the insult to Ada. It was the casual brutality of it, the way these men, his peers, viewed and treated those they considered beneath them. It was a reflection of the world he inhabited, the world he had mastered, but also the world that felt increasingly foreign to him in the quiet presence of Ada. He saw Ada flinch, almost imperceptibly, but she did not falter. She continued her task, her face a mask of calm, her dignity intact despite the intended humiliation. Something snapped within Elias. The carefully constructed walls, the detachment, the control, they splintered in that moment. He walked towards the group, his steps measured, deliberate. The laughter died down as he approached. "Gentlemen," Elias said, his voice low but carrying the weight of absolute authority. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. He fixed his gaze on the man who had made the remark. "Your attempt at wit is misplaced in my home. The staff here are under my protection." The air crackled with tension. A challenge to one of their own in this context was a challenge to the established order they all represented. The man flushed, his eyes narrowing. "Just a bit of fun, Thorn," he mumbled, a defensive edge to his voice. "She's just a servant, after all." The word "just" hung in the air, heavy with contempt and dismissal. Elias's gaze intensified, becoming a physical force. "She is a human being in my employ," he said, his voice hardening. "And she will be treated with respect within these walls. Is that understood?" His tone left no room for argument. The other men shifted uncomfortably. They knew the depth of Elias's power, his ruthlessness when crossed. The offending man, sensing the shift in the atmosphere and the unwavering resolve in Elias's eyes, mumbled an unwilling apology, his pride smarting. "My apologies, Mr. Thorn. No offense intended. See that none is given in the future," Elias said, his voice still dangerously quiet. He held the man's gaze for a moment longer, a clear warning passing between them, a breaking of the unspoken code of their circle. Then Elias turned his attention back to Ada, who had frozen, a tray of drinks held steady in her trembling hands. Their eyes met. In her eyes, he saw not just relief, but a profound, startled understanding. And in his, she saw something she had never expected, a raw vulnerability, a fierce protective instinct that had erupted from beneath the layers of his hardened exterior. The societal figures, the guests, watched this exchange, stunned into silence. The air was thick with the implications of Elias's actions. He had publicly drawn a line, not just defending his property, but defending her, a mere maid, against the casual cruelty of his peers. It was a pivotal moment, a declaration, perhaps unintentional, of a connection that transcended the rigid boundaries of their world. The room remained silent for a beat too long, the tension stretched taut, before the host coughed and attempted to steer the conversation back to safer topics. But the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. Something fundamental had shifted, and everyone in that room knew it. The veil of invisibility had been ripped away from Ada, and the armor around Elias Thorn had shown its first public crack. The emotional climax had arrived, not in a flood of words, but in a charged silence, a look shared between two people, and a defiant stance taken against the entrenched prejudices of their world. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over the plantation like a heavy shroud. The air remained thick with unspoken consequence. Elias Thorn had publicly defied the norms of his society, not for profit or power, but for a reason none of his peers, or even most of his staff, could comprehend. The guests departed shortly after, their farewells cooler, more formal than their arrival. Whispers rippled through the house and the grounds. The cotton baron, the unyielding figure of authority, had shown a crack in his armor, and for a maid. This was not just unusual, it was unsettling, dangerous. Ada retreated into her duties, her movements perhaps a little more deliberate than usual, her quietness amplified. She avoided Elias's gaze when their paths crossed, the shared look during the climax a weight she carried, a burden of unspoken meaning. Elias, for his part, felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and apprehension. He had acted on instinct, a fierce, protective urge that had bypassed his usual calculations. It felt right, yet terrifyingly exposed. He knew his actions would have repercussions within his social circle, but for the first time, the potential professional consequences seemed less significant than the internal shift he had experienced. The silence between him and Ada after that day was different. It was no longer just the absence of words. It was filled with the echo of the words he had spoken, the line he had drawn. He found himself watching her more openly now, his gaze lingering, searching her face for a reaction he couldn't name. She remained composed, outwardly unaffected, yet he sensed a subtle change in her as well, a quiet strength that seemed to have deepened. One evening he found her in the library, sitting in a worn armchair near the window, the faint light of dusk illuminating her profile. She held a book in her hands, one of his father's volumes. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide for a moment before she quickly lowered them. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. "You were reading?" he asked, the question unnecessary. "Yes, sir," she replied softly. It's a beautiful story." She held up the book. It was a collection of poetry. Poetry. He, Elias Thorne, master of ledgers and cotton yields, found himself drawn to a woman who found solace in poetry. The irony was stark, almost comical if he had allowed himself humor. "My father, he liked poetry," he said, the words still feeling unfamiliar when spoken aloud. "He had a different kind of strength, I think. A quiet strength." Ada looked up again, meeting his eyes. "Strength comes in many forms, sir," she said, her voice still quiet, but steady. Her words hung in the air, a simple truth that resonated deeply with him. His strength was in control, in dominance. Hers was in resilience, in quiet observation, in finding beauty in unexpected places. He looked at the book in her hands, then back at her face. In that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of his father's quiet world and the tangible presence of Ada's gentle one, the last vestiges of his resistance crumbled. He saw her not as a maid, but as Ada, a complex feeling human being whose quiet presence had, against all odds, begun to melt the hardened shell around his heart. The tension didn't vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer the tension of resistance, but the tension of uncertainty, of venturing into uncharted emotional territory. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was filled with the quiet promise of something new, something fragile, something hopeful. The slow burn had reached its emotional peak, culminating not in a passionate declaration, but in a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of a connection that had irrevocably changed both of them. The resolution arrived quietly, not with grand gestures but with subtle shifts, a reshaping of the familiar landscape of their lives. Elias Thorne did not miraculously transform into a benevolent figure overnight. The deep-seated habits of a lifetime, the weight of his position, the expectations of his world, they did not simply vanish, but something fundamental had changed within him. The harshness that had defined him softened at the edges, particularly in Ada's presence. His commands were less sharp, his gaze less cold. He still oversaw his empire with a firm hand, but there was a newfound, quiet humanity in his interactions, a reluctant empathy that had begun to surface. The atmosphere on the plantation remained tense, the whispers about the Baron's unusual behavior persisting, particularly after the incident with the landowner. The stereotypical societal figures continued to embody the prejudices of their time, their disapproval a constant low hum in the background. But their power over Elias had diminished. He no longer prioritized their opinions or approval above the quiet truth he had found in his connection with Ada. Their relationship remained unconventional, defined by the boundaries of their time and place, but also by the unspoken bond that had formed between them. There were no public displays of affection, no grand declarations. Their connection existed in the quiet moments, the shared silence in the library, a knowing glance across a crowded room, a brief, soft touch that went unnoticed by others. Ada continued her duties as a maid, her position unchanged in the eyes of the world. But her world had changed. She was no longer just an invisible presence. She was seen, valued, protected. She carried herself with a quiet confidence now, the resilience that had always been a part of her strengthened by the knowledge that she was not alone, that she had found an unlikely ally, a protector, in the very heart of the system that sought to confine her. The resolution was hopeful, not in the sense of a storybook ending, but in the quiet, grounded hope that arises from finding connection and humanity in the most unlikely of circumstances. It was the hope that even in a harsh, unforgiving world, quiet strength and unexpected empathy could carve out a space for something genuine to grow. The plantation remained. The cycles of cotton and sun and labor continued, but within its walls, two lives had been irrevocably altered. Elias Thorne, the harsh cotton baron, had allowed his fortress heart to be breached not by force but by the quiet, unassuming presence of a maid who saw him, truly saw him, and in doing so, helped him begin to see himself and the world differently. The darkness and tension of the narrative resolved not into bright light, but into a more nuanced landscape, one where shadows still existed, but where small, quiet pools of light offered respite and the promise of continued fragile growth. The final image is not of a sweeping embrace or a dramatic escape, but perhaps of Elias standing in the library, not poring over ledgers, but looking at the collection of poetry, a quiet, reflective look on his face, the air still carrying the faint scent of beeswax and magnolias, symbols of a world he was slowly, quietly beginning to understand. The air after a rain, heavy and sweet with the scent of wet earth and blooming jasmine, always held a particular kind of quiet. It was a temporary peace, a brief respite before the sun returned to bake the ground, and the work resumed its relentless pace. Elias found himself drawn to this quietness more and more, seeking it out as a counterbalance to the perpetual tension that had been the backdrop of his life. He would stand on the veranda, long after the downpour had ceased, listening to the dripping from the eaves, feeling the air cool on his skin. It was in these moments of stillness that the full weight of the changes within him seemed most apparent. The ruthless efficiency, the singular focus on profit and control, had not vanished, but it was no longer the only driving force. A quiet curiosity had taken root, a desire to understand the less tangible aspects of life, the things that had once seemed irrelevant or weak. He found himself observing the natural world with a new eye, the way the light shifted through the leaves, the intricate patterns on a fallen feather, the silent, determined growth of a vine clinging to a wall. These small observations, once dismissed as trivialities, now held a quiet fascination. He knew this change was tied to Ada, to her quiet influence, to the way she seemed connected to the world in a way he had never allowed himself to be. Their interactions continued to be subtle, their dialogue sparse, but every brief exchange, every shared look, held a depth of understanding that bypassed the need for many words. He had arranged for her to have a small room of her own, a quiet space away from the other staff quarters, a small acknowledgement of her unique position in his regard, a position that remained undefined but undeniably significant. It was another quiet defiance of the established order, noticed and commented upon by the other staff, fueling the whispers and the speculation. The overseers, particularly Jed, still regarded Ada with suspicion, their respect for Elias now tinged with a cautious wariness. They didn't understand his actions, his unexpected protection of a maid. It made him unpredictable, less the pure embodiment of their shared values of dominance and hierarchy. This friction, this quiet resistance from the figures representing the old ways, was a constant reminder of the fragility of the ground he now stood on. But Elias found he cared less about their opinions, their judgments. His world had narrowed, centering, in a way he had never anticipated on the quiet presence of one woman. He still wrestled with the implications of his feelings, the sheer impossibility of them within the confines of his life, the dark realities of their world, the deeply ingrained societal prejudices, the power imbalance. None of this had disappeared. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential conflict and misunderstanding, but for the first time in a long time, the uncertainty didn't breed panic or the need for absolute control. It was tempered by a quiet sense of hope, a fragile belief that something genuine and resilient had taken root, capable of withstanding the pressures of the world outside their shared quiet space. The silence of the rain-washed evening settled around him, a metaphor for the stillness he was finding within himself. It was not an ending, but a continuation, a new chapter written in the language of quiet observation, unspoken understanding, and the gradual, reluctant blooming of a heart that had been hardened for too long. The house, which had always felt like a grand, impersonal structure to Elias, began to take on a different character. It was no longer just a place of business and control. It was a space that contained shared moments, quiet understandings, the faint echo of a different kind of life. He noticed the small details now, the details Ada had always seen, the way the sunlight fell on the staircase at a certain time of day, the pattern of the aged wallpaper in the upstairs hall, the faint scent of lavender from the linen closets. These were the quiet textures of life that had been invisible to him before, masked by his singular focus on the grander, harsher realities of his world. Ada continued to move through the house like a quiet spirit, tending to her tasks with the same diligence, but their paths seemed to cross more often now, their encounters less coincidental and more sought. He would be in the drawing room, supposedly reading the newspaper when she was dusting, and the air would fill with a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the soft swish of her cloth and the distant sounds of the plantation. He learned the rhythm of her movements, the quiet grace of her presence, and found a strange, unexpected peace in simply sharing the space with her. Flashbacks still surfaced, but they were different now. They were less painful, less like wounds reopened, and more like pieces of a puzzle slotting into place, helping him understand the man he had become and the man he had the potential to be. He saw his father's quiet resignation, not as weakness but as a different form of strength, a refusal to let the harshness of the world entirely consume him. He saw his mother's fleeting moments of tenderness, not as inconsistencies, but as glimpses of a capacity for warmth that he had inherited but suppressed. These memories, once buried deep, were now illuminated by the quiet light that Ada had brought into his life. The societal figures continued to cast their shadows, their presence a constant reminder of the external pressures. There were fewer invitations to social gatherings, cooler interactions in town. Elias felt the subtle shift, the quiet exclusion from the circle he had once dominated. But the cost seemed less significant now. The approval of men like Jed and his peers felt hollow compared to the quiet depth he found in Ada's company. He knew their situation was precarious, fragile. Their connection existed in a space carved out between the rigid lines of their world, a space that could be threatened at any moment. But for now, it existed. And in that existence, there was a profound, quiet hope. He walked through the house one evening, the lamps casting long shadows, the air cool after the day's heat. He heard the faint, melancholic notes of the piano from the drawing room, the tune Ada sometimes played. He stopped outside the door, listening. It was a simple melody, sad yet beautiful, filled with a quiet longing. He didn't enter. He simply stood there in the hallway, listening to the music, allowing it to fill the empty spaces within him. It was not the sound of dominance or control, but the sound of a quiet, resilient heart, a heart that had found its melody in the midst of a harsh world, a heart that was, against all reason, quietly stealing his own. The silence after the music faded was not empty, but filled with the resonance of the notes, the presence of the woman who had played them, and the quiet, profound shift that had taken place within the walls of the Cotton Baron's house.